First of all, welcome everyone. It's just nice to get together for any purpose, not just to commemorate the person who shaped our lives so deeply, and to gather around the campfire and to share stories. And I think what deeply characterized Rav Amital, and I think what we all remember so fondly and so profoundly, are the stories. And I was asking myself this morning, why are the stories so formative? And there are a lot of stories in the yeshiva, a lot of legends. I find that with Rav Lichtenstein, the stories tend to be mythological stories. You know, I remember the time Rav Lichtenstein climbed the beanstalk, or I remember the time, because somehow we feel that regular prose is insufficient to capture the magnitude of who Rav Lichtenstein was. So these stories, these outlandish stories that we had, was the only way we could convey who this person was, this outsized person who lived beyond the normal narrative and the normal prose. But I think with Rav Amital, the stories played a different function. And it's not incidental that the most memorable part of Rav Amital convincing that first class to come to yeshiva were the two stories he told them. The famous baby story, the crying baby story, which has become, of course, the DNA of the yeshiva. And the other story, which I'm not sure is as popular, but he told the story about the chassid who got thrown into jail, and the Rabbi came and bailed him out. And finally, at a certain point, the Rabbi doesn't want to bail him out anymore. And the chassid starts, or the Rabbi's son becomes very harsh towards him. Chassid starts crying and says, "You don't realize I'm a ganav, ich ben a ganav, I'm not a tzaddik. You're a Rebbe for tzaddikim. All you want to do is rebuke me. Your father, who was a Rebbe for a shayim." Rav Amital said, "I want to open yeshiva for a shayim." It's a lesser known story. But I don't want to tell the story now. I was just referring to the story. But it was fascinating to me that the genesis, the big bang of the yeshiva, was formed because of two stories. It became legendary. And I think that with Rav Amital, it reflects the fact that he grounded us, and stories are much more grounded. Abstract ideas, they're powerful. And they tend to be systemic because they're categories, they're concepts. You can apply them in an associative fashion. They're not just limited to the context. We all know that about Brisker Lamdas, when we're able to develop a category from a halacha, the definition of Kinyan, the definition of Yerusha, the definition of Kiddushin, we then can take that category and export it elsewhere. That's the power of systemic thought. And I think we all got that systemic thought from Rav Lichtenstein, who took us up to the heavens and gave us very abstract thinking. But the danger is, applicationally, do you apply it to your life in a real way? Does it just remain abstract? Does it filter down to your subconsciousness? Does it really affect your identity and your existence? And I think Rav Amital was very grounding in that respect, because he was so human, because he was so grounded, because he demanded that we not ignore our humanity, that we concede and acknowledge our humanity and the limitations that humanity brought with it. Not just a general platitude, but that we should embrace the limitations of who we are as humans. And if you want to, it's a very, very quick phrase. Hope it's not an empty phrase. I think Rav Aaron challenged us to soar like angels. And Rav Amital reminded us that it's all right to be humans. And I think those are two very important poles in our life. Without our ambition and our drive and our ability to extend ourselves beyond limits, we end up courting mediocrity. But if we're too demanding of ourselves and too strict and too unforgiving of ourselves, we become unforgiving of others, and then we're crushed, and we crush other people with those weighted expectations. And I feel that the stories for Rav Amital are just very, very human stories, human beings in common. By definition, ideas aren't human-based. Ideas are concepts, or abstract stories about human beings interacting with one another. And I think it was a very silent way of grounding us in our humanity. The other idea that I was thinking about just today as I was musing over Rav Amital and the stories is I think that when he told stories, either about himself or about people, we realized that the backstory to his stories were riveting. Namely, he told a story, but we know that the story of his life, the larger trajectory, the life he lived, was historical and was reflective of the 20th century. And it was reflective of the 20th century in very, very different settings, in the pre-world of Europe, in the disaster and the catastrophe of the Holocaust, and then the reconstruction of of the state of Israel. He used to tell us, I was in a cheder in Hungary, and then I was in a concentration camp in Central Europe, and then I fought in the Independence War, and then ultimately I stood at the Suez Canal. And you really felt as if this was a trajectory that was running through all the major events of the 20th century, but it wasn't just severed from it. He very much was a part of that century, relating to that century. I think you can pretty much take Rav Lichtenstein out of the 20th century and just reinsert him, reimplant him in any other century, and he would make sense. Obviously, you have to adjust and you'd have to adapt, and your differences, and he's a product of modern thinking and modern secularization. But you could rig it so that Rav Aaron could be an 18th. Sometimes he sounded like it in 19th century. Matthew Arnold. So Rav Aaron really did sound like he belonged from a different century. But Rav Amital was really about our century. Everything he spoke about, and in particular, the desire to reinvent and reimagine the modern yeshiva with the understanding, which was heretical when you think about it, that the old yeshiva models just weren't sufficient. Essentially, that was the statement. We can't just continue business as usual, business as normal. It wasn't just taking the old yeshiva model and wedding it to new ideas such as Hesder or Tanakh. It was reimagining rabbis without jackets and ties, reimagining yeshiva without smoking, whatever it was, whether it was highfalutin issues or more grounded issues. So Rav Amital was very much not just the stories he told us, but we felt as if he was living a storyline of our century, and he was interacting with the major issues that were occurring to our people and to humanity. I just ask everyone to please mute themselves, or Rabbi Friedman, could you mute everyone except for me? And thank you. And I think the implicit message was the relevance of Torah to the world around us. I think we all feel very, very deeply that everything that happens in our world, not just in the Sefer, not just in the Ketzelos, and not just in the Shulchan Aruch, but everything that happens in our world, there is a Torah view to that. And we want to try to articulate that view. And I think we take it for granted sometimes, but then you realize not everyone processes it that way. Some people are completely disinterested in the world around them, which is fair. Some people are interested, but the manner in which their Torah experience comments on that world is very, very marginal. We feel in our heart of hearts that we can excavate a Ramban and apply it to social justice or apply it to monument, statue, whatever issues are. And I find myself doing a lot of this and thinking back and saying, why do I even think that? And why do I sense that so few other people outside of our orbit? Because I think it was tacit in Rav Amital's backstory, not just the story he was telling us, but the context within which those stories, the personal stories or the fictitious stories of all these personalities in Europe, the Mendeles and the Rabbanim, and there's a real story going on behind this story. So I like to just share stories with people and hear what stories touched you, the stories he told us, or the stories about him. But I just feel it was important to take a step back and say, well, why are stories so formative? With Rav Amital, we tell Rav Aaron's stories, but again, they tend to be the exaggerated, inflated, as if we're all homers just trying to capture the war between Athens and Greece. And the only way I can capture it is by telling some story of great heroics. And we exaggerate it because he led an exaggerated life. So I think the Rav Aaron stories are very, very different than the Rav Amital stories. Not just content, but function. Not just the content is different. The Rav Aaron stories are always him winning the gold medal in the Olympics while he's finishing Shas. And the Rav Amital story is always being a human being. But the function of the stories, I think, was always very different. Rav Aaron was just grasping for straw. How can we even describe this person? Let's tell a story. The Rav Amital, I think the stories conveyed a sense of, well, I could be in that story. I could have been that story. That story fits me. I don't think we all imagine ourselves in the Rav Aaron stories. I think we can imagine ourselves in the Rav Amital stories. We can put ourselves in. So, what are your stories? Love to hear them.
I'll tell one story from a summer that I was a counselor on Machach Ba'aretz. Machach Ba'aretz at the time spent a week in yeshiva, and one of the features was they got a Q&A with the Rosh Yeshiva, one each. At the time there were two Rosh Yeshiva, and they had a Q&A with Rav Amital. And we didn't filter the questions in any way. The kids are able to ask what they want. And Rav Amital comes in the room. So he's like, why don't you come up and translate? You could tell the group of American kids wasn't so fluent in Hebrew. And so I was there to translate the following exchange. A kid asks him what Rav Amital's view was of co-education. And Rav Amital said to him, a few years ago, I visited a school in New Jersey called Frisch. And they asked me that question. And I said to them, Halimud ze lo abaya, ze ma shekoreh acharei halimudim. It's not the learning that's the problem, it's what happens after school or after class. And the kid followed up and he said, is it okay, teacher, for secular classes? And the way he phrased it, he was implying, well, obviously not for the Judaic studies classes, but maybe for the secular classes. And Rav Amital said to him, no difference. You could have a female teacher even for some Limudei Kodesh studies. So the kid, incredulous, couldn't believe it, says to him, would you have a female teach in your yeshiva? And Rav Amital looked at him and said, when the Chama Leibowitz was alive, she taught here. And I got from the whole exchange was, first of all, a way to talk to an incredulous teenager being a punk to a Rosh Yeshiva, but also he had conviction in all his answers. He wasn't looking to give the popular answer, neither about co-education, and he said, these are my convictions, these are my shittot, and he was willing to present it. He didn't sugarcoat it for anyone, and I really took a lot from that exchange that I was a part of, translating for the students to understand.
I think you taught us what? Can anyone hear me? I think you taught us a lot of. I think you taught us a lot of honesty. And to be honest, you can't sugarcoat. You have to express your views, and it won't always gain you a popularity.
I'll share just my very, very first exposure to Rav Amital. When I first came to Gush, for whatever reason, someone put me all the way in the front of the Beit Midrash. And I was sitting literally on top of Rav Amital practically. And, I don't know anything. I'm a Shana Aleph kid who just happened to show up there. And I noticed that he was always humming. Every time he would walk past my desk, he was always humming songs and or he would walk very slowly. Everyone knows Rav Lichtenstein obviously walked with a certain power, carrying 100 Sfarim and walking faster. You can't keep up with him. I don't know. Rav Amital walked very slowly, sort of moved over to his desk. He always was humming back and forth. And he would just look at me and smile. Every time he passed me, he would just look at me and smile as he was humming. And as a young kid who just got to yeshiva, who obviously had zero confidence, I would say, in any ability to ask him questions or speak to him or engage with him. Obviously that changed, as time was on. It was so heartwarming and it was such a warmth that I still remember it. And it really had an impact on me during that very, very beginning of my time in yeshiva. My chavrusa changed. I actually got moved back. And then when I came Shana Bet, I actually was right back sitting right next to him. I used to learn with Lifshitz. What was Lifshitz's first name? I don't know if it is. Yaakov, thank you. So Yaakov Lifshitz is my Shana Bet chavruta, and we sat right next to Rav Amital. At that point, we would actually ask him questions and talk to him much more. But I'll never forget being a young Shana Aleph kid and having him smile at me all the time, always with a hum, always with just a panim that really was very warm. That was my first impression of him, and just totally different than my first impression of Wolfson, obviously on so many levels. But my first memory.
Yeah, I'll change the continent for you and bring you to Manchester in UK. So good to see you guys. In my second year, I was approached by an Israeli, didn't know who he was, some ginger-haired Israeli, and spoke to me about going to Cape Town, of all places, for the Kollel Tzioni program. Here I was, an unassuming Brit. I was going to go off traveling to other part of the world with a group of Israelis. And I said yes, and I left yeshiva probably sometime after Shavuot. I thought, I'm going to go away from home for a third year. Let me spend some time back at home with my family before going away to another part of the world for another year away from family. And I don't know why, but Rav Amital came to the UK shortly after I came home. And I thought, amazing, I've left yeshiva, but the Rosh Yeshiva is coming to the UK, coming to London. So I went to hear him speak. And he walked in and he saw me, and the very Matal Sepo. And I was totally thrown. The Rosh Yeshiva knew who I was. The contingency of Brits, I don't know if it's changed today, but back in, when Seth and I were in yeshiva, back in the late 1990s, the Brits were just, we were a very small contingency in a sea of chutznikim of Americans. The MTA were their own defined unit. And we kept to ourselves, we interacted, but we were a small minority, and definitely didn't imagine that the Rosh Yeshiva would have a clue who we were. And the fact that he walked into the room, smiled, his beaming smile, and paid attention to someone who clearly he remembered from being in the Bet Midrash. And it made me feel incredible. And I definitely think that sense of humanity and transmitting a love of his students to all of us, regardless of whether we were literally in the front row or metaphorically in the front row of Shir Klali, and being able to follow what he was saying made no difference. There we were part of his yeshiva. He was proud of us, and he made me at that moment so proud of being in the yeshiva that when I went off to Cape Town, I really felt here I was an ambassador of the yeshiva even more. I mean, it helped to have Yossi Slotnick, who also was a Gush guy, but I felt I could serve a purpose. And even today, and I can say it in this context because it's like-minded people, but I've started for the last 2 years, I'm writing for a national UK Jewish newspaper. It's very Haredi, very right-wing newspaper. Ad Kedei Kach, it used to have pages in the back in Yiddish. Like most papers have the sports pages in the back. This one had the Yiddish pages in the back. And I'm secretly sharing Gush Torah very proudly, not under the Gush name, because they wouldn't appreciate it. I think the Rambam got away with it as well, not quoting his sources. I don't have to quote my sources. But I'm telling you, the MS of Rav Amital's Torah it's so pure and so full of love and so true that it doesn't matter where the audience comes from. It's being appreciated to an audience that probably never heard of our yeshiva and would never have understood it. But it's because he made me feel so special that I have now, decades later, continuing the legacy of what he showed, both in the writing and also in my own teaching in the classroom and with my own students. I think I've definitely embraced that lesson and carrying it through as a proud ambassador of the yeshiva.
What's the name of the newspaper?
The Jewish Tribune.
Okay,
I'll leave you for the Yiddish translation.
Michael? Rabbi Michael?
Yeah, Michael Balinsky. Hi. So I was in the yeshiva in 1974-75 when it was much smaller. We weren't in the Beit Midrash yet. And then also I had already graduated YU. And then we came back, so the year, it was during 1976, I think Rav Amital came to the States, may have been his first visit. It was after a horrific tragedy at the yeshiva in which, in a practice exercise against terrorists, someone had a loaded gun and one of the fellows ended up killing another member of the yeshiva. And it was obviously very hard on Rav Amital. And so he came to the States, and I was in Smicha at YU at the time. He stayed with the Kahn family. Their son Toby had been in the yeshiva, Ellen Kahn and Herbert. He stayed at their apartment, and Ellen sort of looked after Rav Amital. And we had this wonderful both Shabbat with him, and there were about 20, 25 of us who went to spend Shabbat in Riverdale. So it was a very intimate group. Our whole Kfutza from Chutz La'aretz the year before had been 17 of us. So it was a very small group. But the real schut I had is that Ellen asked 3 of us to be in the car when we drove HaRav Amital back to Kennedy to send him off back to Israel. And it was just after, literally, his last appointment was visiting and meeting the Rav Soloveitchik. And so there were numbers of stories that have been came out since then. We heard them, in the car as such live from Rav Amital. Among the things Rav Amital asked the Rav was, why was Rabbi Riskin, who was still in the States, why was he so successful? The Rav had a cute answer for that. But we also had the opportunity to hear the story the Rav told about himself that in various forms, Rav Wolfson has mentioned it numbers of times. But what the Rav told Rav Amital, I could be in a snowstorm, and people would drive 2 hours in a snowstorm to come hear me give shir, but deep down in their hearts, they think I'm an apikoros. And Rav Amital shared that story with us. He had just actually heard that from the Rav. But that whole experience of that trip to America, going to the airport with him, with Ellen Kahn, making sure that he had too much stuff, so she's getting people to take some of his gifts, on the airplane, so it goes under their weight of their luggage as opposed to his, and everything. It was just that sense, again, what everyone has mentioned, Rabbi Tarragon mentioned, just that deep sense of humanity and normalcy, and that wonderful smile, and his ability, and the way he told the anecdotes and reported to us what the Rav had said, with obviously tremendous respect, but also with a smile and tremendous affection. And that was really the week he was in the States was really a wonderful opportunity in a real small setting to get to know him.
The story that Rav Benjy told. So I have a corollary story of a related story, and it speaks to his smile, and it speaks to the charisma, and it speaks to him making you feel embraced, even when he was presumably chiding you. It sounds like I don't know if Benjy is still here, Benjy, but it sounded like he was saying, "Mata po," like, "What? Why are you here? Why are you not in Eretz Yisrael?" So I remember in the 80s, we didn't have internet, we didn't have VBM, so we had no connection with the yeshiva. So our only chance to reconnect with the Rosh Yeshiva was dinner time. Dinner was always 2 weeks before Pesach, and the Rosh Yeshiva came in for the dinner. So it was a good way to get all the alumni to come to the dinner. And Rav Wolfson would speak in very, very lengthy fashion about very highfalutin issues. All the dinner guests had to hear the ideology of Hesder, part 3 or something, whatever you want to talk about that year. And then Rav Amital would get up, and he would read from these index cards in his pidgin English, would be an overstatement.
Tamshich litrom.
His English was poor. I mean, he was reading mistakes in vowels and consonants. I am very happy to be here with you tonight at the Gush. It was clear he was reading off of these index cards. We could use your money for, and then in the middle he would always say, I would like to speak to my students in a little Hebrew now. And then he'd raise his finger. This is the only time we saw him. He would look at us with all that passion, with all that warmth, with all that charisma. And he'd say, Atem talmidim sheli, ma atem po בארצות הברית, אנחנו בונים את הארץ, אנחנו נשחטים בלבנון, החיילים שלנו, אתם תתביישו לכם. And you could hear a pin drop. But miraculously, every single Talmud was sitting there mesmerized. I mean, Yirmiyah couldn't pull it off. I mean, Yirmiyah didn't pull it off better. I mean, he was just lambasting us. And just, we wanted more. And somehow there was something unique about that look, that charisma, that warmth, that care. the mystique of who he was. And he'd latch into us for 2, 3, 4 minutes. Screaming at us. And then he'd finish and he'd say, Achshav, Boner Code. And we'd all get into the middle and start dancing with him. Who in their right mind could pull that off? Rebuke people for 5 minutes, the top of his lungs. Achshav, Boner Code. Run and scream and hug him. So there was an it factor that Benjy was speaking about. He just felt embraced. And the song, the smile, the humanity, he just felt was a real human being. Even to this day, when I go to Rav Amital's kever, I walk right up to the kever, I feel completely at home. I feel like I'm right there. I say Tehillim, I feel his presence. When I go to Rav Aaron's kever, I'm very scared. I start out about 20 feet away, then maybe should I go further, if I make it over there. It's a very different experience. And the embrace that he gave us was very, very complimentary.
I'll share a couple of things. One, I think is familiar to all of us, but it's still, to this day, I find remarkable. And for me, it brought back the notion of Emunat Chachamim. And that's the very invitation that Rav Amital made to Rav Lichtenstein to become the Rosh Yeshiva. And of course, Rav Lichtenstein said, no, we would have to do it as a co-Rosh Yeshiva. And to watch how they shared fully, completely, all of the responsibilities from the Shir Klali to each Shabbat, they took turns, and the mutual respect that they gave each other was just remarkable. It remains with me today. And I came out of a very political period in Chicago where I saw kind of things that I didn't understand. I had come into Skokie Yeshiva at the time when Rav Aaron Soloveitchik was leaving. That was my introduction to the Yeshiva world and Orthodoxy in general. And I didn't quite understand what I was seeing as a young high school boy. But I came to understand a lot more as I got older. And then, as I said, to see this yeshiva in action, and that somebody would so selflessly give up his malucha was remarkable. The only other example that I know of is Male Adumim, and it's very likely that invitation that was offered there might have been under the influence of a previous generation. So that's one item. A second is I actually didn't have all that many interchanges with Rav Amital. I was kind of indoctrinated that the Rosh Yeshiva for the Americans was Rav Lichtenstein, and Rav Amital was for the Israelis. And so my approach to one of the two, I went to Rav Aaron. But my first real contact was with him as the Bal Tefillah. And I wasn't one of these people that went back from year to year for the davening on Yamim Noraim. But to this day, when I daven on the Yamim Noraim, it's Rav Amital's voice. When I'm davening well, that's the voice that echoes in my ears. There was just something remarkable about his power as a shaliach tzibur that carried me, and I saw it carried the entire yeshiva. That humanity that people have talked about before. That here's a person who's leading you in tefillah. This is the person that you want to lead you in tefillah. Because he was really representative of the tzibur. Third story, so Rav Amital with the Shana Aleph guys, it was later in the year, but he met with each one of us. And I remember he asked me what my Seder HaLimud was. So I was proud of myself that I was doing something independent, different than what everybody else was doing. And in the second Seder, I think I had an hour in the day that I went to the library to learn history. because I felt that in my yeshiva high school career, we didn't take Jewish history very seriously. So I was going to make up for it. And I told him, I thought for sure he's going to give me a pat on the back. Oh, good. You're making up for something that you missed. And he gave me Musar straight. He said, do that, after the end of third Seder, or do that on your own time. But this is your time to learn Bishkeda, Gemara, and he didn't hold back. He didn't sugarcoat anything. And he kind of burst my bubble, thinking, I was thinking, oh, I was broad-minded here, and he would be embracing of that. And he wasn't going to allow me to be proud of myself, that his directness and straightforwardness came through. And I don't know if that changed my behavior, but it certainly made an impression on me, that here's a person who, lives a truthful life, says it as it is, says it out as he sees it.
Rabbi Berman, I'll tell you that I was one of those people who did come back actually year after year for Yom Kippur. And I was one of the first ones to buy the CD when it came out with all the tunes. And I'll tell you that I was absolutely mesmerized by the Yom Kippur experience in HaRav Amital. And I think I came back, 5 or 6 years in a row, or something like that, after yeshiva, maybe even more, I don't remember. But Ada Yom Hazeh, I've never experienced Yom Kippur davening as what I remember from HaRav Amital. It changed the whole experience.
Sure. I'm not unique.
Hi, everybody. I'm sitting in an outdoor cafe. I'm not sure I can be heard. Yeah,
we hear you, Rabbi Wolfson.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful hearing all of these. Thank you, Ms. Harrigan and Jonathan and everyone for sharing stories. It's great to hear people who describe being at the yeshiva in the 70s. I think of myself as, in some ways, very lucky that I was one of the last generation of Talmidim to get to know him. My Shana Aleph was his 80th birthday. It was sort of like the Chinese year of Rav Amital, like the whole year revolved around it, many celebrations. I think I remember him joking that perhaps when he was 81, they would stop making him 80th birthday parties. And I was there for a year and then spent 3 years at university in the UK, and then I came back, and by this time, I guess Rav Amital was 84 or 85, and was could really see he'd aged a lot in those years. And as I think Rabbi Grauer mentioned, I was also extremely lucky, and through no merit of my own, to be placed more or less next to Rav Amital for that year, which was a huge split. I think a couple of things in terms of the memories that sort of stay with me. The first is sort of similar to what some people have already said, but with a different emphasis. He took a lot of the pressure out of things, a lot of the seriousness, the heaviness out of things which I think I'd been taught either explicitly or implicitly to think about as very heavy things. So that the atmosphere of my high school, and I think even the atmosphere of a yeshiva, is you've got to think about yourself very seriously, and your career decisions, and who you're going to marry, and are you going to do smicha or are you not, and are you going to move to Israel or are you not? And I remember, I think I absorbed from just his the way he would conduct himself and speak, but also sometimes explicitly, he would take a lot of the heaviness out of these questions, and things didn't need to be as dichotomous for him. And for me, it was a tremendous relief to be able to sort of like imbibe some of that. Many years later, I read a quote from someone which I liked very much and which seemed to sort of capture something of Rav Amital. It was funny context. It was think it was an aid worker in some of the world's sort of most disastrous humanitarian zones, who was asked by an interviewer, like, how do you keep sane amidst so much, terrible human suffering? And the person said, I take what I do very seriously, and I don't take myself very seriously at all. Which I've sort of taken on as a bit of a mantra, to be able to take what we do extremely seriously, but also to sort of to be able to smile at ourselves and look at ourselves with a little bit of irony and humor. I think that was something I found very much in Rav Amital. The second point, I'll finish with this. In the last few months, the months of COVID, I've very much felt Rav Amital's presence in terms of the story of the Tinok HaBocher, the crying baby. I feel like in some ways that story is it's a tragedy that in some ways that we know that story so well that we almost can't take it seriously anymore. It's like almost like a Lo B'Shamayim Hi type story. It's been so used and so quoted that we just sort of smile at it. And I think that, we maybe forget how many people there are, I guess I'm speaking of myself, really, not of others, how many people there are who didn't have our level of exposure and intimacy to Rav Amital and the yeshiva, who actually, therefore, we downplay the significance of that story. In my own work, I'm the JLIC rabbi at NYU in downtown Manhattan. We sort of lost our community overnight. The university closed in mid-March. People went home. There were no more classes, no more university classes, no more shiurim, Shabbatot. We essentially reoriented ourselves around providing a volunteer response to just the enormous need in New York City, whether hunger, whether age and isolation. And if I sort of think of the guiding image, it's without a doubt Rav Amital's emphasis and re-emphasis and repetition so many thousands of times of that story, which I guess sort of seems to have been quite a poetic parallel to the upcoming Yahrzeit.
While we're waiting for the next speaker, I'll just share an interesting story in light of what Rabbi Berman said. Today in Yeshiva, they made a 70th birthday for Rav Meidan. Many of us were Rav Amital's 70th birthday. So it's held outside in the square of the Yeshiva with large, social distancing, shir chazon ish. Boys here and boys here. And it's really, really nicely done. And speakers, and very, very scaled down, but it's really nice. And essentially one of the themes that a lot of the Rebbeim spoke about is, and Rav Meidan, the contrast is so striking because he's so passionate and he's so opinionated and he's so fanatical and he so strongly holds of his ideas. But wherever there are administrative yeshiva issues that have to be decided, he will only give his advice after excessively encouraging everyone not to listen to his advice, and whatever you say is Kodesh Kodashim rather than whatever he says is Kodesh Kodashim. And of course, it's a testament to Rav Meidan. But I think it's really something which Rav Amital was able to implant into the DNA of the yeshiva. Maybe Rav Meidan excels in it maybe more than some of the others, but there really is very little room for ego at any level in yeshiva. It's almost as if their tone hovers above the yeshiva. And creates, there's very, very, I don't know, the inner rooms and the inner conversations, but there's very little politics or personality politics and ego in the way. There may be differences of opinion, maybe other limitations, but so it's nice to see that it's translating to the next generation.
I'll add that he got something from Rav Lichtenstein today on his 70th birthday. He also gave Shir Koli and 2 Chugim that are up on the YouTube channel, and he was in the base medrash all day preparing for these and there for Talmidim. So he took something from both Rosh Yeshiva.
I'll follow up on Rabbi Tarragon, just the connection between Rav Amital and Rav Meidan. The first time that I heard, again, that now very famous story of the child crying, I was in yeshiva from 92 to 94, and it was during Oslo. Rav Meidan had pitched a tent in the Mashpir and went on a hunger strike to protest Oslo and the peace process. And he spent, I think, a week and a half to 2 weeks outside the Mashpir in Yerushalayim, inside the tent on a liquid-only diet, giving shiurim in protest of the peace process. And Rav Amital got up to give a sikha in the Beis Medrash, and everyone was kind of waiting to see. We knew that the Rosh Yeshiva were in favor of at least giving the process a chance, and they had spoken about it. And Rav Amital gets up, and we're waiting to hear, because he's going to address Rav Meidan. And so essentially, that's all. I mean, actually, all I remember from that speech, I'm sure there was more. But my takeaway and what I remember from Rav Amital's sikha in the Beis Medrash was he got up and he said, I don't agree with Rav Meidan and his politics, and I really don't like hunger strikes, but I really love Rav Meidan. And then he told us the story about the baby crying, and he said, I've taught my students and I value that this is Rav Meidan has heard the baby cry, maybe differently than me, and he went to do something about it. And for, again, sitting there and that, I'm 19 years old, and I think it speaks to what Rabbi Tarragon had mentioned as well, that idea of being able to love someone and respect them, despite completely disagreeing with them, is a very strong and powerful message. And I think really does run throughout the yeshiva and its talmidim. I think like Rabbi Berman and Grauer, I think a lot of, every year before Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, I channel much more Rav Amital than I do Rav Lichtenstein, and try and figure out how to give people in the shul some flavor of the passion and the sincerity of, a Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur experience that really is ever present, in our minds.
I have to add one more word about this davening. I love the fact that he repeated words. It was so, unbrisker, right? So unyeshivish, if you will. But he also brought with him, it was part of his personality, that sense of Masorah. His father was a chazan, his grandfather was a chazan. If they repeated words, he could repeat words. And so we all, v'nemar, 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 it was countercultural. There was something very cool about this old European Rosh Yeshiva who was countercultural in the way that, expressed through the way he davened. It made me feel connected in a way to Masorah, that whatever, maybe in ways much greater than what I got out of a lumdus piece of, a sugya or shir.
Look, Rabbi Berman, if I comment on what you just said, two comments on two different aspects of what you said. First of all, not only did he repeat words, but he skipped words and he got words wrong, which is not part of his aversion for false firmkeit, but the fact he was davening by heart much of the time. And and it was a very authentic, passionate, real experience. He was really speaking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I felt very often in his speeches on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, they say about the Levi Yitzchak that when he spoke to the Kal in Barditchev, he was essentially speaking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to the people. Like HaKadosh Baruch Hu and then to the people. It would be an intermediary between God and people. And I felt that a lot with Rav Amital's Sicho, that he was actually talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not just talking to us, and then interacting between the two and making HaKadosh Baruch Hu very concrete and very palpable. But even in his davening, I felt, I sensed that whenever he got to parts about Am Yisrael, he would start crying. And whenever I hit those parts in davening, I start crying as I remember his tears. But that's just as a complementary story to what you said. But your comments made me feel that one of the things I miss most about Rav Amital is he had a very, very healthy barometer to help judge fake firmkeit from real firmkeit. And he had this phrase in Yiddish, I'd have to look it up, that his grandmother was very formative in his life. They slept in the same room, and she would polish his shoes. If you read the book by his faith, he had a lot to do with his grandmother. And she had some phrase in Yiddish, from is far, rishus, oin, mitzvahs. There's some phrase there.
Yeah, I remember that.
An old phrase.
Fill of Rashias and venom in mitzvahs or something like that.
Right. And I think that's missing today. To be honest, I don't see people that have it. And I think there's a trend in our community towards polarization. And the easiest way to reaffirm our sense of firmkeit is to just adopt chumros and be very careful about discarding them. Alternatively, some people have an allergic effect to false firmkeit. I find that the pendulum swings too forcefully in the other direction. There's a lot of erosion and a lot of distancing from healthy. I think Rav Amital had a very, very healthy barometer. As you said, Rabbi Berman, of Masara, of firmkeit, but without some of the fake pietudinous, preening, just to show everyone, like, why would you not want to repeat on Rosh Hashanah Kippur? Because there's 600 people in the rooms. It's a great opportunity to show everyone how firm you are, and rather than maybe firmkeit expressed in the quiet of your own study. So I miss that a lot about Rav Amital. I don't see too much of it in our world, that balance.
Adam, you have what's that?
Okay, good evening and good afternoon to everybody, even morning. It's really an honor to be with this group, and I wasn't planning to say anything, but share a few experiences. I think mostly they were sort of, he was in many ways, Rav Amital had a sort of un-Rosh Yeshiva side to him. He was a Chevroner in one sense, very much Gadlut HaAdam, sort of Slobodka style, and he liked, he always dressed nicely, and he wanted the yeshiva to be aesthetic, and wanted the Bachurim to feel, let's say, positive self-esteem, but he was somewhat self-effacing. Some of the experiences that I had were when my friend Josh Berman got married, and Rav Amital was the Masada Kiddushin, and we were sitting, and I was one of the Adim, and he said, I was a young rabbi, and he said, Adam, you float out, you know what you're doing, he's sort of empowering me and sort of saying, I'll step back. And it was, I was very embarrassed by this, of course, but it made me feel like he had confidence in me and that he didn't have to be the one at the center. Also, when I was Shana Bet in Israel, in Yeshiva, I'd wanted to go to the army very much. And in the end, I decided to go back to YU for a few years first before going back to Israel. And I'd become very close with the Shana Bet guys who were, I guess it was the Shana Aleph guys, who were going into the army after Pesach. And I found out that I was there until Tisha B'Av, and that Rav Amital and I forget his name, Rosh Shiva of Otniel's father, Yedaya Cohen, where the two of them were driving to Julis, I think, to visit the soldiers. So I had the privilege of driving back and forth with them for about an hour and a half in each direction, and just to hear their Sichat Chulin, which was very, there was Torah, and they were just talking about the army and values, and in a way, something that Rabbi Tarek and what Mesh said before, my kids always knew all the years, I would always call Rav Lichtenstein before Rosh Hashanah and Pesach, and now I call Tova, and I would shudder. You could speak in front of 500 people and not be nervous at all, but to call Rav Lichtenstein and talk on the phone with him, it was a real emat, I don't know how to describe it, but it was something, and it was powerful, not a palpable feeling. I don't think it was a negative one, but it was a particular dynamic. Rav Amital was sort of much more kind of everyman man about his interaction, and I think that maybe carried over also into his approach to halakha, his approach to Am Yisrael, not sort of trying to be much more of a with Amcha, with this Talmid being a Talmid Chacham, etc. Also, I don't know, Mesh, do you remember this when Rav Amital did sort of a sabbatical for 6 months in America when we were back in YU, and he spent a lot of time in Riverdale where my parents lived and where I grew up, and we would just get together for an oneg on Friday night, and it was interesting at the time. I don't think we realized something, at least from my era. Our era was the early 80s. It took Rav Amital years and years to really get over, if he ever got over, Lebanon. And he sort of came to America to help the yeshiva, to learn English a little better, but I think he just needed to get away. It's really unbelievable how much he cared about every Talmud, and that whole experience was very difficult for him. And maybe, I hope this comes out. To me, it's a very positive thing, but other people, or certainly when we were younger in yeshiva, I think it was a little harder for us to understand. Rav Amital taught me that you can change your mind. Rav Amital re-examined his thoughts and his ideas throughout his life. And if you read his writings and you see his public behavior and you see his involvements, both as a educator and as a public figure, he didn't feel obliged to be, foolishly consistent. He certainly developed and evolved, and to me, that's a human being again, but it's also somebody who is in a constant process of developing the relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's world. It's real, it's palpable, it's dynamic, it's meaningful, and therefore you don't just stay at a plateau, but you're always engaging. And to me, that's an example from Rav Amital that I found very inspiring. Thank you.
Just to reinforce the important points that Rav Adam just mentioned about Rav Amital changing his mind, I think we all realize, I'm sure there's others on this list, I'm interested if other people have other things in mind, but I think the two issues that we're exposed to is he changed his mind on the role of women's learning. In the beginning of his time in yeshiva, he didn't feel that it was that important. Towards the end, he was very, very strongly endorsing of the Migdal Oz project. And certainly his views on Zionism have changed and were changed. And Rav Kook's infusion of Zionism, I'm sure of Adam, you could speak about that at great length. But certainly the Lebanon War changed his views on of Rav Kook's Zionism and Messianism. Evidently, I don't know the details, but evidently, there was a graduate student in some department, I don't know which university, who prepared his thesis on Rav Amital and his ability to change his mind. There were some students who actually wrote about that. And he showed it to Rav Amital with a lot of pride and expectation. Rav Amital read it quickly and said, I didn't think you really captured it. And the boy went away feeling a little bit distraught. And then Rav Amital, I don't think this was cosmetic. He said, I changed my mind. I think you're going to do a good job. And I think it was real. Again, the story is very sketchy, but people tell that story with great relish. The other point you mentioned about how Rav Amital lived loss very deeply, I encourage everyone to listen to Rav Lichtenstein's Hesped for Rav Amital. And one of the points that Rav Lichtenstein noted in his Hesped for Rav Amital was that Rav Amital invented or established the notion of a Rosh Yeshiva feeling shchol for his Talmidim. And it's something we, I don't want to say take for granted, because it's not something we ever want to take for granted, but we all know the stories about the Yom Kippur War and what it did to Rav Amital. And I saw the last loss that Rav Amital suffered. It was a boy in yeshiva from Efrat, actually. He died in a training accident, Uriel Liverant, Zichrona Livracha. And I was at the funeral with Rav Amital, and I was at the stage where he was still walking with his cane already. And I think he even had a comment like this, is that something, I don't know if it was in a speech or he was saying it to himself as he was walking to the coffin or walking to the body, saying, you know, something like, I thought I didn't have to go through this again, or how much more do I have to go through, or something. It was very, very raw about having gone through this nightmare and having thought, and now realizing that he has to go through that turbulence again. It was a very, very raw moment in front of the dead body, or in front of the parents. I forget exactly where. But that was clearly the comments that he had.
I'll just add one more thing. A strong memory for me was actually not in yeshiva, was going to Rav Amital's numerous times for Sudash Lishit at his apartment in Givat Mordechai. And he really opened his home. Every Shabbat, whoever showed up, there would be a beautiful Sudash Lishit. I don't know how many of you had that experience. It was very special. And it was, again, he was this Rosh Hashiva who let you into his family and said, I'm normal, you know, and it blended together. It wasn't bifurcated. You know, I have my image as the Rosh Hashiva, and then I have my home. It was sort of a fluid type of experience. And I know if you ever talk to Yehuda Mirsky, he spent lots and lots of hours with Rav Amital at home, and it had a profound effect on him. And the numbers of times that I had that experience were very memorable, and he was extremely engaging and personal, and really showed his personal care.
Okay, let's take some time to think about Rav Amital this week. I'm sure the yeshiva is going to produce a lot of shiurim and a lot of videos and a lot of information. There's a lot out there. And hopefully we can continue to, as Rav Adam said, he taught us to continue to grow and to feel confident enough to change our minds, and confident enough to admit our limitations, and confident enough to admit our mistakes and to admit our humanity. And that's what makes, I think, a Rosh Hashiva's or Rebbe's message enduring. As if it's a message for 18-year-olds and it's static, then you wake up one day and you're 38 and you have a Rebbe, or 58 and you have a Rebbe. But if it's a changing, dynamic human message, it doesn't have a prefabbed shape to it. Just has sincerity, authenticity, and tradition driving it. So I think it can adapt to different ages, different people, different contexts. Let's hope that we continue to adapt his message. And on a separate note, I want to thank Rav Friedman for putting it together, and of course everyone else who thought of the idea. And please, there's an open forum, so if anyone has a great idea for getting together, I think we all enjoy it. I think we all have very, very busy schedules, so we don't want to overdo it. But let's try to find time and ways to speak with one another when it's not just the Yahrzeit of a Rosh Hashiva, or not just an immediate response to the aftermath of COVID, but in a way that we can just create a group just to share common ideas. So please feel free to recommend to anyone, myself, Rabbi Friedman, try to put things together.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. These are really very special.
Thank you very much. Shakar.
Take care.